Morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this roundtable discussion on child abuse prevention in the Asian Pacific Islander communities. My name is Cindy Shin, and I am the founder and CEO of KACIE Strategies. And I am just so delighted to see so many of you taking interest in this topic and for attending today's event. Now, we are still in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, and it's a huge concern that child abuse reports are still down and abuse may be going unnoticed. And this is largely due to the fact that children are out of sight of their mandated reporters, such as the teachers and the physicians. And to make matters even worse, you have the isolation, unemployment, economic hardship, and all of those kinds of stressors that families are experiencing due to this pandemic may actually increase the incidence of child abuse. And this is why it's such a critical time for us to continue with our outreach and prevention efforts. Now, as we talk about and continue to do our prevention work and educate our communities, it's very important to be cognizant of the different cultures that may influence how people perceive abuse or their willingness to report, intervene, and even want to accept information on child abuse prevention. Now, I always say that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all outreach plan, and it's so important for us to be mindful of these differences and create a culturally responsive outreach plan as we approach these various communities. Now, today I am wearing multiple hats. I am the host of the event, the moderator, but most importantly, I'm also here as a survivor of child abuse myself. Well, I should say thriver, actually. And I've also experienced many years of physical abuse as a child and many more years of the emotional, psychological abuse, which actually led to almost 30 years of suffering silently from depression, which nobody knew about. And this is mainly because I was not able to get the help and support that was needed. And growing up in a Korean household, I know firsthand about these cultures that make it so difficult for victims to speak out, to seek help, and for people who are even aware of the abuse to want to report or intervene. And of course, I'm grateful to have been able to overcome this painful past. And one of the main reasons why I host these types of events is so I can do whatever possible to help bring more awareness to this topic, and especially in the API communities, because I know it's just not talked about enough. And I know that there are probably a lot of children and even adults out there who may be suffering, but are not able to speak up and receive the help and support that they need. And we need to make sure that we continue to have these discussions and work together so that those people don't have to suffer for 30 years like I did. So hopefully today's discussion, as well as my experience maybe, can help us understand even more so how much of a big role these cultures play in the work that we do in prevention and outreach. Today, we'll be discussing the long-term effects of child abuse, how cultures may influence perception, reporting, intervention, and even the understanding of abuse. There are many out there who may not even realize that what they're experiencing is abuse because they were probably brought up to think that what's going on is normal. So we'll talk about that. And some of the challenges that we all may experience in our work and your work in child abuse prevention due to cultural backgrounds and beliefs. And of course, the importance of culturally sensitive outreach in the API communities, as well as the prosecution and prevention work in the city of Los Angeles. Now today, as you can see on your screen here, I've invited a great group of experts to serve on this panel today. First of all, we have LA City Attorney Mike Feuer. And many of you may or may not know this, but I actually used to work for the City Attorney's Office for over a decade doing media relations and community outreach work. And I had the honors of serving 3 city attorneys, including City Attorney Feuer, who I have so much respect for. He is someone who truly cares about the communities. And what I loved most about him and the administration is that they truly believe in prevention work. And that's what I believe as well. And that's one of the reasons why his office has so many different prevention programs out there in the communities, including those to help victims of domestic violence and child abuse that he, of course, will be discussing during our roundtable. We also have Dr. Michi. She is a licensed psychologist with a specialty in cross-cultural and international mental health. She's also a professor at Alien International University and visiting professor of the National Taiwan University. Dr. Fu was also a participant in my ethnic media roundtable that I put together several months ago on mental health issues. And she was so great that I had to bring her back for this one. So thank you very much, Dr. Fu, for joining us again. Monica Borunda, she is a licensed marriage and family therapist, adjunct faculty at California State University, Los Angeles. And she's also the lead forensic interview specialist at the Children's Advocacy Center. We have Katherine Yeom. She is the executive director of the Korean American Family Services, which is a nonprofit that provides services to not only Korean, but also to other API immigrant families, particularly those struggling with mental health, domestic and family violence. And we have Payal Sawhney, president of the Saahas for Cause, a nonprofit dedicated to educate and empower South Asian immigrants on issues related to older adults, women, youth, and community health. So those are our 5 panelists for today. And to all of you who are on this call today, we have about 120 people registered for this webinar, and so many of you from various government agencies, child advocacy groups, community organizations that provide services to DV and child abuse victims, as well as those serving children with disabilities. So thank you all so much for recognizing how important this is and for attending this webinar. Now, before we begin, just a quick announcement. So after the panel discussion, we'll be able to answer some of your questions. And if you look on the bottom of your screen, we have both a Q&A box and a chat box. So please make sure that all of your questions go to the Q&A box, and any comments that you would like to make, please put that in the chat box. And since we have a lot of people on this call, I'd like to ask you to please make your questions as simple and as short as possible and indicate who your question is for. And of course, if we are out of time and not able to answer all of your questions, I'll make sure and do my best to get those responses for you and email them all to you following the webinar. So now I'd like to ask our City Attorney, Mike Feuer, before, of course, we get into the details about what your office is doing, if you could just please say a few words and help us open up today's conversation.
Thank you, Cindy, very much. And thank you to all the panelists who you've assembled as well. Cindy, I want to say something quite personal about you before we dive in. You mentioned your service in our office, and we miss you tremendously. I actually don't like it when you refer to your office. It's still our office as far as I'm concerned. But what I want to say, Cindy, is I really applaud your courage and your leadership on this issue. As you mentioned, to overcome the stigmas that you grappled with, to come forward and discuss your personal experience, and then to say, I want to take this to a new level. I had this experience. No one else should have that experience. So here I am, Cindy, leading an effort to make sure that others can go through life without having to bear burdens that I bore. I think, Cindy, that is just marvelous. So thank you for that. And I think that in some ways, framing this discussion through that very personal lens makes this a much more immediate rather than academic conversation, which I appreciate. I want to say that I am well familiar with the issues that we'll be discussing today. They're issues that, as Cindy mentioned, are at the intersection of 2 different important points. One is the issue of child abuse, whether it's physical or sexual abuse in API communities, but also how that intersects with issues of culture. We went, Cindy and I and others, to Korea a few years ago, where I had an opportunity to work with prosecutors around family violence issues. And we discussed very openly the issues in the Korean community and Korean culture more broadly, which I will say pertain to many API cultures, where the collective is elevated over the individual, where there is a focus on harmony and not disrupting the appearance of harmony, where there's a focus on conformity, where issues of shame and loss of face are highly significant, and where paternal authority in a family carries special weight. When you combine those cultural issues, you recognize the challenges that victims of child abuse confront. And I thought that was a very illuminating trip for me, and we brought back many lessons and have applied them here, as we'll discuss in a second. And there are broader issues too, as I'm sure our colleague panelists will discuss, because there are issues of the prevalence of abuse and reporting, and what consequences flow from that, but also issues of treatment and the stigmas in API communities that surround access to mental health, the perception that that is a sign of weakness, lack of trust in the system. These are all really important issues for us to be grappling with today. And one last thing before I conclude my opening, and that is our office is also focused on a very deep-seated issue that pervades all communities, and that is the impact of trauma on developing brains. And the fact that we're focused on trauma through the lens of gun violence and domestic violence and gang activity in the neighborhood. But child abuse is also, of course, going to create great trauma. And we know the brain science surrounding that issue. That includes the fact that kids will never be who they were biologically intended to be if we do not organize our society better and if we do not intervene at the earliest stages to reverse trends that otherwise will consign these kids to not fulfill their potential biologically. So these are very important issues legally, scientifically, culturally, and we're going to be discussing all of them today. So thank you, Cindy, for organizing us. Let's dive into our panel.
Thank you so much, City Attorney Feuer, for those words. And I'm just so happy to be able to continue to do the great work with you and your office. So thank you very much. So let's talk about your office and talk about the prosecution of child abuse cases. Now, we've seen a decrease in the number of child abuse cases being reported. So I can imagine that the number of cases being referred to your office may have decreased as well. Can you tell us about what you're seeing during this pandemic and also just some of the types of cases that are handled by your office?
Sure, of course. I'm going to discuss those issues and some broader implications of those issues as well. So let's start with the fact that our office has a lot of breadth as well as depth when it comes to these issues. We prosecute issues of child physical and sexual abuse. We also engage in a very broad practice tied to domestic and family violence generally. We also, as I mentioned, relate to the impact of kids who were exposed to that violence. The key fact that I think we should lead with is that 85% of child abuse victims know their abuser. And the literature that I'm aware of indicates in the API community, where the father is the more likely abuser, that really accentuates the point of that connection between victim and perpetrator. Now, Cindy, as you mentioned, the pandemic has had many, many impacts on our society. One of them is a reduction in the reporting of child abuse. And to give you a sense of how that plays out in real life in our office, when it comes to child physical abuse and neglect, in the last year, in 2020, we filed 313 such cases. Year before, we filed 414 cases. Gives you some sense of the diminution. Last year, we filed 226 child sex abuse cases. In the prior year, 267. You mentioned, Cindy, that one of the key issues is that when kids are at home and don't have contact with mandated reporters, especially at schools, it is much less likely that their stories will be told. And that's a fact of life that we are wrestling with, and we're trying to overcome in a variety of ways. So, I want to talk also about not just prosecution, but also about prevention and outreach and other issues. So let me dive into some of the preventative work that we engage in. One thing that is very important for our audience to know, if people are worried that kids will be re-traumatized as they go through the criminal justice system, we train our staff in avoiding that. We train our staff in preventing re-traumatizing those kids. We also train others who are integral to the system, from the Department of Children and Family Services at the county and the school district and LAPD, among others. We also have, I alluded to this issue of trauma, and it is tied to prevention. And let me just spend a second talking about this unique program we have, because it transcends child abuse itself, but I think it's worth talking about. So I've been very focused on this issue of childhood brain development and how, as an office, we can do work that is a catalyst for changing the trajectory of kids' lives when they're exposed to trauma. So we focus on gun violence first. And we identified the location in South Los Angeles, it turns out, where there are the most shots fired calls. We then collaborated with the Children's Institute, which provides therapeutic interventions, LAPD, communities, and schools. So now, when there is just a call indicating there was a shot fired, not that there was a kid who was shot, but just possibly cognizant of what happened, these teams go into the neighborhoods, they look for kids who may have been cognizant that the event occurred, and immediately work with them and their families to offer timely intervention, which includes therapy for free. We also educate parents and teachers and administrators at public schools about the signs that kids have been traumatized, and that those signs can relate to any of a number of sources of trauma, including child sexual and physical abuse. We have, since we originated that program, expanded it quite dramatically, both geographically throughout most of South Los Angeles now, but also in terms of the topics that we focus on, because we recognize that there are many sources of trauma, and our kids cannot be, as I mentioned earlier, consigned to never fulfill their potential because adults haven't figured out how to insulate them from trauma that they have nothing to do with, but yet has a huge impact on their lives. We also conduct outreach that extends beyond what I just described. For example, Cindy alluded to the fact that in the pandemic, we have a very different dynamic. We discussed the fact that kids have no one to report to, and in general, kids and moms are trapped with their abusers. So we worked with LAUSD to create a program that is suggestive of other work we could be doing. And we sent information to the sites where LAUSD was disseminating food and to grocery stores. We worked with the grocers as well as LAUSD because those were locations to which otherwise, like moms who otherwise would not have been gotten access to information could get it. And so, for example, in the context of domestic violence, one key bit of information we wanted to describe to them is you don't need to physically call the police in the presence of your abuser, which could be dangerous. You could just subtly text and someone will come to your door. I choose it as an example because there's some very common sense and practical lessons from that kind of outreach. But we do more than this, and as it relates to this particular convening today, I'm very pleased that Katherine is with us. So we have a memo of understanding between our office and the Korean American Family Services organization. We signed this last year. We refer kids and families who need support and advocates to KFAM, and they provide not only linguistically appropriate intervention, they can speak in Korean and Mandarin and Cantonese and Tagalog and others, but they also provide support in two key ways. They support the child through counseling, and they'll go to court also to wrap their arms around this child in the judicial system. And that, I think, is a kind of example of a partnership that others could replicate in other jurisdictions around the state and around the country. Culturally sensitive counseling and teamwork in the court system, these are pivotal to giving children's parents the sense that if there is a report that's done, they'll be dealt with in a way that is sensitive and fair and nurturing, as opposed to the way it used to be. We also engage in other prevention. And I want to describe one aspect of that prevention very quickly, and that is we sometimes prosecute, as I mentioned, but sometimes in the event that there is no actual physical injury and there's no criminal record, but yet we have a sense that there was some abuse that happened, we set those cases what are called city attorney hearings. In those hearings, we make sure to educate parents about the importance of appropriate discipline in interaction with their kids. And we also require that they go through parent education sessions to underscore the point. And they have to show proof to the hearing officer later on that they've completed that program, which is like a really important aspect of this. I also want to talk about our partners in law enforcement generally as I wind down here. We have many partners in this. I mentioned KFAM as an example, but in law enforcement, we have partners too. And we've joined with what's called the Electronic Suspected Child Abuse Reporting System, which I want to just translate for a second what this means. This means that we and 15 law enforcement agencies, think the DA, think other child protective agencies and so on, we all can access the same databases when it comes to allegations of child abuse. And that enables us to do two things. First, enables us to uncover what may be patterns of abuse that if we only took this case in isolation, we would never know about. And second, it enables us to uncover potential witnesses, which is a very important point when we have a child versus an adult who will disclaim responsibility for actions they took. And I mentioned training, I mentioned earlier, but in this context, I want to say we've trained DCFS, we've LAPD, even the Boy Scouts at LAUSD on mandatory reporting issues. We discussed the fact that in a pandemic, those mandatory reporters are less likely to have contact with kids, but we are training to assure that post-pandemic, those regimes are in place. We have, as Cindy knows, a robust victims assistance program, which speaks in many languages, accessible to API families when there's child abuse involved. And I want to underscore the last point I want to make. I know from community forums we've conducted in which Cindy was involved when she worked in our office, that there remains in many communities, including the API community, concern, it's the residue of the prior administration in Washington, that if they are not, if they do not have citizenship status, that there may be some negative consequence of coming forward. I want to underscore we never asked about immigration status in our work. So Cindy, that's the overview I wanted to provide. I hope that's helpful. I'm eager to hear from other panelists. Gives you the sense though of the breadth of our work and how really significant it is to affecting families and most importantly, kids. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, City Attorney Feuer. And you talked about all the prevention work that you do. I think that a lot of people don't really understand that the City Attorney's Office is not just about prosecution. It's about all of the prevention work that you guys do and all those outreach programs. And I'm so happy to hear about all these partnerships that you have as well, even in the communities. And, I also want to encourage all of those API organizations who are on this call to reach out to the City Attorney's Office and learn about the many different programs and outreach that they do. And perhaps you can also build a partnership to try to get those resources and information out to all of the API communities. Thank you so much. And City Attorney Feuer, you also mentioned our trip to Korea. I remember we had this a joint seminar with the Seoul prosecutors, the Seoul Western prosecutor's office on domestic violence and child abuse issues, like you mentioned. And right now in Korea, there's this huge movement going on. It's a story about a 16-month-old baby who was abused by her adoptive parents. And there were numerous reports from her pediatrician, as well as the daycare teachers and staff. And somehow the case kept getting closed, and eventually she ended up dying from her injuries. So it's just a huge shock to the entire nation. And so they're discussing ways to ramp up their prevention efforts, and a huge movement going on right now to encourage the public to be more vigilant and to make more reports. And all of what's going on in our mother countries, and that's why I mentioned this, is that it affects the people that are here, the immigrant families, because they learn about that and they also are affected by all of those stories.
Very important. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you so much. So let's see, let's talk to Monica Borunda. So forensic interviews are such an integral part of an investigation of alleged child abuse. And Monica, for those who may not be too familiar with forensic interviewing, can you please briefly describe what your role is once a child abuse report comes in, and how you work with partnering law enforcement agencies?
Sure. So for a child forensic interview, right, is what we're doing at the Children's Advocacy Center. We get our referrals, which means the district attorney's office, the city attorney's office, law enforcement agencies, DCFS workers, any of those professionals can call us and request a forensic interview for a child between the ages of 3 and 17. We can also interview adults with developmental delays. So we do a forensic interview. Ideally, every investigative partner is present. So ideally, we have the law enforcement officer, we have the DCFS worker, and a prosecutor attend. And then a forensic interviewer will sit with the child alone in a room while the partners are watching from another room. We interview the child in an age and developmentally appropriate manner, right? In a non-leading, trauma-sensitive way that is legally defensible, right? So we're not asking leading questions. Did X happen? Did, so-and-so do this to you? We say, tell me why you came to see me today. And then when they tell us something bad happened, tell me everything about that. So everything is done in a way that is legally defensible, appropriate to the child's age. That's basically what a forensic interview is. And it also provides, those investigative partners the information that they need so the child doesn't need to be interviewed multiple times.
And I'm sure you've conducted many interviews of children in cases of alleged abuse, including those of Asian descent. Now, what are some of the cultural considerations that are taken in forensic interviewing, and perhaps some of the challenges that you may be facing due to these language and cultural barriers?
Sure. So the language is probably the first thing we consider, right? What language does this child speak? And we've also changed it to what language is spoken in the home, because we know that even if the child is in kinder, first grade, even elementary school, if there's a different language primarily spoken in the home, that's probably the language that we want to interview the child in. So ideally, we would have a trained forensic interviewer who can interview the child in that language. And even if they need to flip-flop between their home language and English, that would be fine too. The other considerations, the other obstacles I think that we see is that a lot of the children that we interview don't know that what is happening to them is actually abuse. They don't know that it is not their fault, that they shouldn't be carrying around this guilt and shame, right, due to what somebody else did to them. They also, many of them, and I'm including even older teenagers, right? And I've spoken to a lot of adults in different settings, but a lot of these children don't know the names of their body parts, right? So that's a challenge. If they come in and say to me, so-and-so touched me down there, then it's just an additional, I need to find out what down there is, what it's called. They don't know who is able to handle their bodies and how their bodies can be handled, and when that line is crossed to something being inappropriate.
I think especially in certain API communities, because we're taught not to talk about certain things, which I could see that there probably would be more difficulties in finding, and for you guys to find the answers that you may need to prove that there was any type of abuse that happened.
Right. One of the things that I say to parents when I'm working with parents is we should be talking about, and I just use the terms, I've been doing forensic interviewing for over a decade. If you're changing a diaper, you should say, I'm wiping around your penis, or I'm wiping here and there, so that the child gets used to that language. A lot of the time, what we do as we're raising our little ones is we say, this is your ear, and this is your nose, and that's your elbow. And then we ignore everything between the shoulders and the knees, as if those body parts don't exist, don't have a name. We need to teach them what those body parts are called, how to keep them healthy, how to keep them safe, and talk about them just like we would an ear, so that it's comfortable. And when they do come, unfortunately, if they have to come to a forensic interview, they can say, this was done to my butt or my breast or my, vulva or my vagina.
And you talk about the sex abuse cases. I know that you mostly handle sex abuse cases, but also some of the severe physical cases. And another
Yes.
cultural barrier is that a lot of people in living in this culture are taught not to say anything that may hurt their parents, because they were just taught, if you say anything that'll embarrass or get your parent in trouble, then even sometimes the immigration, the status issue, then we're going to get kicked out of this country. Those are the certain things that a lot of children hear from their parents, which I can imagine that you may also have difficulties getting answers for those questions as well.
Yes. So to be clear, we interview any child who has disclosed or is suspected of having been sexually abused, severe physical abuse, or any minor who has witnessed any type of domestic violence or homicide, things like that. So we'll interview those children. And you're right about the other piece of it, right? Even when children aren't specifically told you should not talk to anyone about what happens in the home, they kind of learn that, right? There's other messages that they hear, and they know that that I shouldn't talk to someone about this. They also, even when there is abuse happening in the home, there's this attachment, right? And they love their parents and they want to be with their parents or another relative. They just want the abuse to stop. So they're struggling with, what do I do with this? I don't like this, but I don't know that it's wrong. I don't know how to talk about it. There's a lot of shame around it. And I don't want to, do this to my family.
And what happens when you're not able to get that type of verbal confirmation that the abuse had occurred?
Well, if we have a child come in for a forensic interview and they're not able to disclose for different reasons, right? They're just not able to, even though maybe they have the language and know how to do it. I have had kids say, I can't, like, I just can't get it out. I can't say it. I can't do it. If we don't have some type of disclosure and something that the law enforcement officer or the attorney or the social worker can work with, you know, it's tough. How do you move forward from that? There's probably a better better question for our attorney here to answer what happens when we don't get a disclosure that's significant during a forensic interview.
Do the cases get closed usually after that?
We see a lot of cases get closed, yes. And, you know, see it get closed, or they find them inconclusive, you know, so sometimes we're not happy about the results, but we also can't blame a child for not being able to tell us a story, a narrative, when they haven't been taught to do that, when they don't have the language, the comfort level talking about certain body parts.
And so what needs to be done? Do we need to do more education, more outreach to the children, the parents? I know that you do a lot of training and education as well.
Well, yes, we do need to do more training and more outreach. I am a huge fan of just like, let's describe as many parents as we can and talk to them about, you know, how to talk to their children about their bodies, about their body parts, about who can touch them, when to tell, right? Sometimes even there are cases where children have said, before this person even touched me, I already felt like this creepy feel, you know? So do our children know that we want them to tell us someone or something is creepy? We want to know about that person before something happens. That's important, right? To listen to our children's instinct, their gut instinct that is telling them something's wrong, this person doesn't feel safe, and what can I do, right? Do I have control of my own body? Do I have the power to say, I don't want to go there. I don't want to kiss someone hello or hug someone. So yeah, I think outreach, talking to our kids, it's an ongoing conversation, right? We're having certain conversations with them when we're changing diapers, other conversations that are more evolved when they're 2 and when they're 5, and it just develops, right? Because we need to keep those lines of communication open about everything, drugs and alcohol, but also about abuse and sexual abuse and what it is and what to do about it.
Well, I think that this is also a great opportunity for you to be connected to all of the API organizations as well, to see how you can work together and partner up with this type of education.
We would be happy to partner with anyone, any organization. We have gone out to DCFS, to 2 different DCFS offices in the last couple of weeks and told them this is what we do. It's a free service for anyone. Please call us, right? Call us if you have any questions. So we're happy to do that for any DCFS office, law enforcement agency, or you know, any prosecutor's office. We're also happy to partner with any of the other agencies here to provide training around this issue.
Okay. So let's talk about these cultures that make it just so difficult for people to talk about these issues, to report and to intervene. Dr. Fu, let's start with that. So can you talk about these cultural differences that affect perception and the even understanding of abuse?
Thank you. First off, happy Lunar New Year, everyone. And a big thanks to KACIE. Cindy, you're really amazing to work with. And I admire the good work that our city attorney's office, as well as our other panelists here do. So I also really appreciated getting to work closely with the Asian unit of DCFS when I was working as a supervisor in community mental health. And I can also see some of our community partners signing in from Orange County. So I think we actually have the choir here of folks that are invested in this kind of stuff. I myself had training as a postdoctoral fellow in sexual trauma. So my specialty in working with children's abuse really deals with sexual trauma. So unfortunately, the general statistics that we hear out there, like 1 in 4 girls experience child sexual abuse at some point, or 1 out of 13 boys might, and things of that sort. The numbers actually might get a little bit fuzzier when we're looking at Asian Americans because there might be some underreporting. So obviously the different types of abuse, some might be considered more taboo than others. So there's physical abuse that we oftentimes think of, emotional abuse. Some cultures might not even consider that abuse. It might be considered good parenting. And then obviously my specialty is complex sexual trauma stuff. And there's also neglect, which can also be kind of hard to quantify. Like as a Generation Xer, is the way that my cohort was raised, is that considered neglect? On some lines. So some of the long-term impact that we see the literature saying for the general public are also what you might see in some Asian households, but it'll vary depending on acculturation and all that. So long-term impacts would be regular things like anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, being socially withdrawn. In severe cases, people can dissociate, a break with reality. On a very basic level, having difficulties trusting in relationships, and possibly experiencing flashbacks or having some hypervigilance and persistent fear. So those are the psychological and mental effects, but there are also behavioral outcomes. So things like I see a lot of self-harming behaviors, eating disorders, alcohol and other substance use or abuse, and sleep difficulties tend to creep in, having a lot of discomfort being around others physically, having to repeat grades or be absent from school or work, even things like criminal activity. And if folks don't seek treatment, it is possible to become a perpetrator. I even saw a recent statistic saying there's some sort of a link, higher risk for developing cancer. All that being said, when you look at someone, these are the general descriptors of like mental health impact, but maybe it'll look different if you're in an Asian family where expressing your emotions are not always very encouraged. So one of the other questions I was asked to reflect upon was to think about how long-term effects are not just caused by the abuse itself, but by the inquiries of others afterwards. So I really appreciate what our other panelists have already mentioned, that it is hard to get people to open up. What I've seen is that, and it also works this way with the literature, people who suffer the first injustice or trauma do have a very hard time getting over it. But when they disclose, if they're believed, that has a very different outcome. And if they are blamed for it, that also means something to the psyche. So even if 20 years later, someone says, clearly that shouldn't have happened, if you've been growing up with the script saying, I'm bad, I caused it, and that may happen in some families, that there's an emphasis in maintaining a hierarchy or a patriarchy. So there's a lot of research that shows even if just one trusted adult says, I believe you and I'm sorry that it happened, if I was there, I wouldn't have let it happen, that leads to far better outcomes. So the process that goes into whether to disclose or not is very complicated, depending on several factors, including the child's family of origin and their values, as well as like where do they live geographically. As someone had mentioned, like maybe we need language matching. So it's not always easy if someone finally musters up the strength to get help. I was also asked to comment about cultural differences in upbringing that influence the way abuse is perceived. So this is a little bit tricky because there's such emphasis on children's obedience to authority, listening to authority figures, and trusting adults and things like that. So there is some tension that can develop between what Western parenting styles deem as abuse and then what some Eastern cultures consider abuse. So as a Taiwanese American, I can say my mother would come back from trips from Asia with switches for children that they sell out in like daily kind of market kind of situations. So there's small, medium, and large, and it is expected that parents will actually try and enforce something by stick and by might. So the way that I know it was for my parents as well as their contemporaries that were trying to raise kids without having these kind of different worldviews to look at was pretty confusing. So some of the cultural differences that I'd been asked to comment about, obviously there's the respect for elders, harmony, but there's also saving face. And that one really gets our communities in kind of a sticky situation when we're trying to balance the need to save face versus call attention to safety issues. So being able to help the children kind of dissect apart any kind of guilt they might feel about the actual event, as well as about the disclosure of it, is pretty important, especially when we're dealing with cultures that are accustomed to not sharing our emotions, because maybe sharing emotions, good or bad, may be considered kind of an uncomfortable feeling for others. Like, I'm glad that you won the lottery, but our family's going to have to suffer for the next 10 years would be like one kind of way of illustrating, like, even something positive is not that it's a little bit frowned upon to share too much. But if you share something where everyone feels like you're airing your dirty laundry, it becomes even more complicated. And then some people might say that there's a spiritual or religious component. So also keeping in mind that there are practices that are considered congruent if you are not just not sparing the rod, but even using other kinds of interventions that might be considered very effective in one's country of origin. And then I was also asked to share a little bit about cultural differences in reporting and intervening. So what to do if you're a family member and you're watching some of this happen. As a clinician, I usually try and ask people to think about who in their hierarchy is accessible that can say something on the family's behalf with a little bit more power and weight. I think overall people are constantly wondering, like, what can I do? And again, since we're preaching to the choir, this is more being able to share this with someone who might be stumbling upon this information for the first time. I oftentimes cite a Kauai study that is a little bit dated, but it's very valuable for my patients to feel validated, that all you need in life is one trusted adult that believes in you, that even if everyone else around you is telling you that you're not worth it and they're sorry they had you and all that kind of stuff, if you have one person, and it could be a coach, a teacher, it doesn't have to be someone related, you'll actually have a shot at life and you can be okay. Part of that, I think, is because as human beings, we have a tendency when we come across trauma, we have a fight or flight kind of experience of, I'm going to crumble and freeze, or I'm going to do something about this. And there's a newer body of research coming out about post-traumatic growth. There are already some models about it, but they continue to shape it often because we're seeing that people who can be engaged in therapy, whether it's CBT, developmental, interpersonal, parenting, just some segue into receiving treatment, the possibility of post-traumatic growth increases. So with that, I'm going to take a pause because I know we were only allotted a certain number of minutes, but I'll look forward to a lively Q&A later. Thank you.
No, that's fine, Dr. Fu. But let me just add, and I'll make my example just to make it, I guess, easier for us to understand about these differences and why it affects so much, about, victims speaking out, seeking help and all that, is because I think that you talked about how, obedience and how we were taught to respect the elder, and in many cases we're thought as less important than the adults. That's how we grew up. And in many cases, when you have victims who at least attempt or try to speak out, they get criticized. They get criticized for going out and trying to embarrass their family or hurt their family. And that just discourages people to go out and seek help, which kind of prolongs that the suffering and the depression or whatever they're going through. And what's very concerning is that support system is so important, but when when you have family or relative members who know about the abuse and don't want to do anything about it because you're the child and those are your parents and they raised you, then it just makes it even more tough to not have that support system. And when you do try to do something about it, you get criticized again for doing something bad to your family. And I think that's a huge concern. And hopefully we could try to do more education to let not just the public to be vigilant, but also family, relatives to speak up, because they need to learn about these long-term consequences that come with this type of child abuse.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And one more thing is that I think it's just so interesting how it's so easy for people to criticize the child, the victim, for doing something like that, and yet it's so difficult for them to criticize the adult who's the abuser. They never say anything to the adult, which I think is another reason why there needs to be more education.
And that's why I slid in the parenting component, that not just DCFS, but many of our therapists and things like that are kind of faced with. It's not maybe the child that asked for this kind of a life or whatever, but they have to deal with the ramifications of it. Oftentimes the parents don't have a different script. So we're afraid to criticize them. We're also afraid to teach them sometimes. I find I had a case of a 17-year-old who was sick and tired of being sick and tired. So he called DCFS on his mother, and it was one of the best decisions in his life. It enabled him to graduate high school. Later on, he could circle back around and help his mother get the help she needed. But for the longest time, he experienced guilt because everyone was saying, how could you do this to your mother? So I appreciate what you just shared, Cindy. Thank you.
Definitely. So let's talk with Katherine from KFAM. So why is it so important for us to have these culturally sensitive outreach methods?
Hi, everyone. I would say, for KFAM's mission is to empower underserved Korean American and Asian Pacific Islander families through culturally responsive services. So already in our mission, we state how important culturally responsive or culturally competent programs and services are. And, we've been in the community since 1983, and I think the key component of what we do involves that, and that's how we can get community engagement because we're culturally responsive. And there are many factors that shape into an individual's belief, opinions, and learned behaviors. And in every community, culture plays a big role in shaping individuals' views. And each culture has their own stigma, expectations, barriers to overcome, and unspoken rules. So, I think a great deal of our success is that we're able to do things in multilingual and multicultural perspectives. And our staff reflect that. But they understand the community. They stay connected to community members. They speak the language, responds to the distinctive needs. And we collaborate with a lot of local community agencies, whether it be working with ethnic specific media or faith-based organizations. So, I think that really just shows how important it is to be working with, to be able to do culturally sensitive programs and services.
And like you said, you've been around since 1983, so you've been around for a long time providing services to these communities. And I'm sure you guys also have experienced challenges trying to educate our API communities, particularly about issues like child abuse. Can you just make some examples of what has worked and what has not worked in the past?
Sure, and I think, Cindy, you and Dr. Fu touched upon it, but, there's in the Korean and Asian Pacific Islander communities, there's a lot of, cultural unspoken rules, and that problems like child abuse or domestic violence, mental health are expected to stay within the home. Involving non-family members can be seen as a disrespect to the parent, signs of weakness and failure, embarrassment to family honor, reputation, and I think Dr. Fu mentioned saving face or to save face. So for KFAM, we really focus our outreach and education around strengthening families, creating healthy relationships within a family, discussing cultural differences in parenting skills, like raising children in America, and how to make families stronger. So those are the ways that we kind of tailor our education and outreach so that we could reach out to the Korean and API community.
That you mentioned before that in some cases for some events or seminars where you wanted to educate parents about child abuse issues, you actually had to make sure that child abuse was not in the title because people wouldn't come.
Yes, so that's a example that we always use is we never talk about child abuse and we never say like child abuse seminar. We always joke around in our agency that we put topics like how to get your child into Harvard, and then we start talking about your parenting skills. What is your family dynamics and relationships, and then we talk about child abuse, child neglect, and topics like that.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about outreach, it's very important to know that it's not just the first generation, the non-English speaking community members. It's also people like me who speak English and may have lived here, most of their lives in the United States. We were still brought up under our Korean parents or API families, and so we learned that culture, and it's very important to also reach out to that community as well.
And a lot of, I think there's been studies around it too, but just from our experience, we do have second and third, even fourth generation Koreans and Asians who come to us for services. They might not even speak a word of an Asian language, but they still come to us because of that cultural tie. They were brought up with immigrant, grandparents or parents, or they have aunts and uncles. So, I think the culture stays. So even if you're born in the United States, you're westernized, and let's say like you don't know anything about your culture, there are little things here and there that are taught by our family members or friends without us even knowing. And I think that really shows when our clients are, fourth generations, they still want a Korean or like a Chinese speaking or a culturally aware counselor, family advocate.
And perfect example is me. I mean, I speak English and I even work for the city attorney's office, dealing with all of these child abuse issues. And still, I was still stuck in that culture where I just thought that I was only supposed to feel thankful for just being able to, be healthy and live a good life that I kind of created on my own, actually. But, it stays with you. And I didn't really realize that until I actually had kids of my own. And then I realized, wait a second, these kids are so precious. Why would anyone do anything so horrible to a child? So it takes, for some people, a long time, 30 years like me, but I think it's very important for us to continue doing this type of work so we can, get to these people as early as possible. Thank you, Katherine, so much for that. So let's talk with Payal Sawhney with Saahas for Cause. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Can you talk about what the perception is like of child abuse in the South Asian cultures?
Absolutely, Cindy. Thank you for this opportunity. General perception in South Asian immigrant is that we are very family-oriented community. We don't have child abuse in our community. Socially, we are very complacent and hence not ready to face the reality. We are made to believe that it does not happen in our society. It is problem only of the West. And when it happens in a South Asian family, then people don't talk about it and just keep it inside the house because their family will be shamed. This cycle and perception perpetuates. Just like any other culture, the impact of a family conflict on any child is always huge. Although in that time of conflict, the need of a child can easily take a back seat. And in South Asian context, especially if it is a girl child, gender disparity exists in South Asia. There is high preference for a male child. This can lead to increase in abuse of a girl child in South Asian households. South Asia suffers from cases of female infanticide. Hence, sex detection sonogram is banned during pregnancy there. Due to this female infanticide, sex ratio is skewed in South Asia, leading to rise in gender-based violence and child abuse. Some common trends that we see are child marriages, lack of education for girl child, and child labor. It is important to understand about the nature and extent of child abuse in South Asia as people don't dramatically change their behaviors because today they migrated to United States of America. Behaviors continue.
Yes, thank you for that. And before we move on, I know that City Attorney Feuer has another important meeting to attend to, and he has to leave right now.
I just wanted to say, I do need to leave. Thank you so much, Cindy, again, and all the panelists for such an informative and provocative presentation. I wanted to mention that Lara Drino, who heads our office's work on child abuse issues, will be available during the Q&A session. This is work that she has done for a couple decades, and her expertise is tremendous. Thank you again, Cindy, and everybody for this panel. And Cindy, it's great to see you. Take care. Good luck.
Thank you so much, City Attorney Feuer, for your time today. And I look forward to having you on again for our next roundtable. Okay, Payal, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you for your patience. So now, do family structure and parenting styles, let's talk about that. I know that there are some similarities, but also differences in the family structure and parenting styles compared to those in the East Asian or the Southeast and East Asian cultures. Can you talk about that? And how does that influence perhaps the likelihood of child abuse or even for the understanding of abuse?
Absolutely. Our families are usually multi-generational families, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Even after migration, the trend continues. Even if only the couple or nuclear family migrates, still there is huge involvement of in-laws and extended family long distance from the host country. Concept of boundaries do not exist. We follow collectivistic family concept. Family honor and name in the community is paramount. Parents from South Asian descent deal with pressures of living successful American dream and proving to their community. Pressure of transferring culture, traditions, and rituals to the next generation. Identity crisis, financial pressure. All of these pressures together impact parenting style, which mostly ends up becoming dictatorial and rigid. Parenting style has the effect of model minority myth, where they knowingly or unknowingly push their children towards high performance in school and traditionally accepted vocation. This kind of parenting has a potential for generational gap and thus a setup for abusive relationship. Children of South Asian immigrant, similar to any other immigrant, can suffer from dual identity challenges, causing for confusion and might rebel against family to fit in with their peers. Another important point is lack of open communication between parents and children. This is not only due to generation gap, but due to acculturation gap. Sex and dating are taboo words. There is no clear communication between parents and children inside the house about these very important developmental milestones. This puts young children in double bind. If they are in a dating relationship, then they are not comfortable telling their parents about it and they hide. In case this relationship turns out to be abusive, then they are at loss and don't know who to go to. These cases end up in teen dating violence or self-harm. Different speed of acculturation leads to challenges and pressure of hybrid parenting, which can be another risk factor for abuse.
How is the reporting like in your communities?
Very, very important question. I would like to answer this question from the article written by Shanta N. Kunukolu and Ramaswamy Malalingam in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. Statistics regarding the prevalence of child abuse in South Asian community are challenging to obtain due to cultural stigmas and taboo surrounding sexuality, mental health issues, sexual, physical transgressions, and familial conflict. This is compounded by the model minority stereotype of Asian Americans, which is an idealized representation of this immigrant group that has been found to produce a host of positive and negative mental health outcomes. Internalization of model minority myth impacts perceptions held by South Asian individuals regarding the prevalence and consequence of child abuse in their community. Negative consequences of this stereotype also includes the internalization of an idealized identity, which contributes to masking of the underlying reality that would shame one's family and community openly. Level of acculturation, in addition to internalization of the myth of being a model minority, shapes the likelihood of South Asian individuals to seek services when in distress. At Saahas for Cause, we did a pilot research to understand the level of acculturation and help-seeking behaviors in South Asian immigrant women. We found that women who fell in the category of separation on the acculturation scale were least likely to seek help, whereas women who fell in the category of integration were very likely to seek help. Neighbors or friends will not report, thinking that it is not their business. South Asians are scared of authorities in general and will want to avoid any interaction with them. Hence, there is pervasive inhibition and taboo in interactions with DCFS. Among other factors, lack of basic knowledge of child abuse, lack of awareness of existence and nature of the services available to respond to it, fear of public exposure if child abuse was disclosed, fear of meeting culturally insensitive professionals, other cultural concepts like izzat, which means respect, haya, which means modesty, and sharam, which means shame, also influence their reporting behavior. Some South Asians may not report, or they might opt not to report, but rely on spirituality instead, due to certain core spiritual beliefs like karma, which means fate and destiny, or dharma, which means right action in Hinduism.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned about others intervening or making reports or stepping in, and I think it's very similar to our culture that many people have that mentality of this is my family, and it's none of your business. And because of that culture, others also feel the same way. They, even though they may suspect abuse, and maybe sometimes it's very obvious, they hesitate because they're afraid that they're stepping over boundaries. But I think it's very important to know that no, it is your business, and your actions or the lack of actions may actually impact this child's life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, you guys do a lot of outreach work and prevention work as well. And what are some of the challenges that others, that may not be familiar with the API cultures, what they may be, challenges that they may face when they try to educate families in their communities?
I think definitely that acceptance and that scare of that, they are not going to understand my culture. And not being able to speak the language, or even if you give therapy, but if it is not in the culturally sensitive manner, then you are going to lose your clients, or your outreach is not going to be effective.
And can you talk about some of the support services that you're providing for child abuse victims and prevention programs to educate the families?
Absolutely. So at Saahas, we are based on prevention. All our outreach efforts are prevention based. So in 2019, we got some funding from DMH, and we did several projects in the community. And one of that was to do the education and awareness to DCFS offices and to school district officials about the South Asian culture, family style, their immigration style, and the parenting. Parenting, it's very important for the school professionals to understand that it's not prescriptive. One size does not fit all. We have our own different ways and means, and so they need to look into the cases or issues that happen in school from the cultural lenses. We also did forums around hybrid parenting, because that's one of the very big challenge, but the communities don't get out and talk. So with help of DMH and their funding, we were able to organize these forums in Jain temple, in Hindu temple, in Sikh gurdwaras, and we invited parents And I'm happy to say that many parents came for these discussion forums and opened up about how challenging it is for them to parent the kids here where they were not grown. They were grown back in home. So those are some efforts that we have done. Saahas also has a Saahas youth chapter where we organize South Asian youth from high school and university. And we give them that safe space to come, organize, and then if they are in need to come and talk about their issues. We use the positive youth development as our model, and it is based on trauma-informed care principles. They produce different kind of public service announcements together. They do teamwork, and they have projects like Saahas Sit Down. It's a podcast that is released every month. I encourage all of you to go and listen on Spotify or YouTube. And when I listen to those podcasts, I feel my work is coming to fruition because they are talking about all the challenges that they faced while growing up. They are talking about the body shaming that they experienced in the schools and colleges, how they felt that they were not accepted by their peers. They talk about their body hair and things like that. And then they also talk about how their parenting at the beginning, they did not understand, why the parents were taking them to several cultural classes, dance classes, and now they think that those are the things that have made them accept their identity. So these are some efforts that we have started. They are indirect ways of prevention and giving them safe spaces. But I'm very proud to say that it's working, and our youth program is growing. The membership is growing. So yeah.
Thank you so much for
Thank
that.
you.
And it's so great to hear that organizations like yours and of course KFAM as well, you guys work together with other communities, but also with government agencies. And hopefully, this will be the first of many conversations that we can all have. And so we can try to, see how we can all work together for this cause. So that about concludes, unless anyone else needs to add anything, that concludes the panel discussion. And our panelists have been so generous and so quick to answer your questions that were in the Q&A box. So we don't have any questions right now. But what I do want to do is, I know that Lara Drino, she's the Director of Child Abuse at the City Attorney's Office. She is here available for Q&A. We don't have any questions for her, but I still want you to still just say a few words. I know that Lara is just so passionate about the work that she does at the City Attorney's Office, and I just want to give her a quick minute just to share some thoughts and the work that she does.
Thank you, Cindy, for having me as well. And I am very passionate about child abuse. I've pretty much spent the majority of my career helping women and children for the first 25 years, prosecuting mainly domestic violence and child abuse cases throughout the city of Los Angeles. And for 12 years, my specialty was child sex abuse cases. And so I appreciate Dr. Fu, you talking about handling these complex child sex abuse cases. Those are near and dear to my heart because I've worked with so many, primarily girls, who have suffered this, and the studies show that complex child sex abuse causes the highest level of trauma for an individual as they grow. And I know one of the questions earlier was about what happens when Monica was talking, when a child can't disclose or won't disclose, like what do we do? And I have to say, first of all, it's very hard as a prosecutor when you're watching a forensic interview or you have talked to other witnesses or anyone and you know that the perpetrator committed the crime, but you don't have the evidence or enough evidence to file charges. And unfortunately, that happens every day. And it's heartbreaking. I'm a mom too. And it's heartbreaking when you know someone did something and you can't hold them accountable. So when a child doesn't disclose in a forensic interview, we look for other corroborating evidence if we can find it. Lots of times, young teenagers will tell a friend, and they'll tell a friend not to tell anyone. And luckily, most of those friends end up telling someone, whether it's a teacher, a counselor, their mother, somebody. And that's how the abuse gets reported. We see that in a lot of our cases. With schools being closed, that's a huge roadblock right now into getting these cases reported. And most of the cases of child sex abuse happen within their own home by somebody that they know. I personally, as a prosecutor, I've prosecuted 6 biological fathers for molesting their daughters, and they all went to trial. They were all convicted. To me, that's the highest level of trauma a child can face. And they all had the signs that they were being molested, but none of their mothers were either aware of it or chose to see it. Now, I have to say, in most child abuse cases, the mothers will blame the child. They'll say they didn't know what was happening. If the child comes to them, they will choose not to believe because it's too hard, because maybe they have their own history of child sex abuse. And that's very difficult for the child to not only be abused by somebody, but then to have their mother basically abandon them. I have to say, luckily, in all the father-daughter cases that I had, the mothers were supporting their daughters once the abuse was disclosed. But those girls, all of them had been cutting, self-harming themselves, were depressed. Many of them had been really good straight A students and their grades started to dip. They didn't want to do activities. So a lot of the warning signs were there, but the mothers either it was too hard to address it or they just didn't see it happening. So I find, especially I know, Cindy, you were with the office when I prosecuted. It was an Asian karate instructor. He also ran a modeling agency. And that case was particularly difficult because my victim was 16 years old and she was mixed white Asian descent. And she wanted to go to the police. She wanted to report it, but her mom and her aunt were trying to keep it quiet. And eventually she went to somebody at school to report it because she knew it wasn't going to happen from her mom and aunt. And it was all about the shame. You don't want people to know this happened to you. You don't want to bring shame on our family. And so I met with her many times where we didn't even talk about the case, but we would just talk about what was going on with her mom now, with her aunt, and how she was processing it. And we got her into therapy. And that's one of the things I should say, our office is very big on making sure that the kids get the support and counseling that they need, whether we file the case or not. So, and I work closely with Stewart House in Santa Monica and CATS in the Valley. And I know Monica for years now as a forensic interviewer, so, and she's amazing.
You are too. But thank you so much, Lara, for sharing all that information. And there are a couple of questions that came through about, what are some of the things that the community agencies are doing to collaborate with faith-based services, and what types of resources are available to the API communities. I know KFAM, you guys are doing some type of training with faith-based leaders too, aren't you?
Yes, so we do training with our faith-based leaders because we noticed in the Asian community, a lot of our community members are connected to a religion or like a religious organization. So whether it be a church, temple, whatever it is. So we've noticed that most people, whether it be a child or adult, if they go through crisis or they're going through trauma, they reach out to their church leaders first, which is the reason why we decided to collaborate with faith leaders. And as we've been doing this project for about 8 years, and we trained over 1,200 faith leaders to become first-hand responders to how to react to family violence, domestic violence, in their community, and then be able to refer them to us where we provide the professional help through our staff.
Thank you for that. And another question that came to me actually prior to this event is related to children with disabilities. I know that we also have a couple of organizations out here who provide services to children with disabilities and their families in the API community. And talk about perception. I mean, the perception of disabilities is also, it's very negative in some of the API communities. And for even abuse to happen on top of that, it just makes it, more difficult than anything. Is there anyone that wants to add anything about some of the work or findings or work that you do related to children with disabilities?
I guess, so just to, what we do when we work with children with disabilities is sometimes speech or talking is not the, easiest or the only way of talking to children and finding out what's happening or if there's any child abuse in the home or in the community. So we've really, switched that over to include like art therapy or play therapy, so that, because every child develops in a different stage, different time. So we wanted to make sure that there were other ways of us, making sure that we are protecting children and children with disabilities. And one thing we've, been really focusing or learning about is that we have to really educate the children, right? And make sure the child knows, like, what is good touch, what's bad touch. So things that, like Monica said, talk with the children and the parents and talk about body parts, giving names, so that if the child goes through, child abuse or child neglect, they can, they know what's wrong and they'll know that they can reach out for help in those cases.
I think in South Asia, I can talk from the South Asian perspective. I think the acceptance is again a big problem in South Asian community. In my clinical experience that I've seen, that a lot of effort that we have to do is to educate the parents that there is autism, what is autism, and they don't want to accept it, and until they accept it they will not go into the treatment or taking care, and it is considered as a taboo. So they will keep it hush hush. They will not talk to the family members or extended family or their neighbors about it, and that is also a problem. And then there is also the blaming of the mother. The mother is blamed for giving birth to a disabled child. So that is also another issue that is connected to working with families with disability in their kids, that to make them understand that there is this genetic disorder, that is why your child, it's not the fault of the mother. It would have happened to anybody else also similarly. So there is a lot of education going down to their level, talking to them in their language that needs to happen, and creating support groups, motivating the community to come together, like ADHD, autism. There are many such support groups in South Asian community that are now created, and now they are self-help groups that they are doing, different movements and camps, so that the new parents can be involved and given support. So those are a few things that I think I would share.
Yeah, I think, and also, especially with children with disabilities, I think that it may be a higher risk for them to experience a type of abuse. I think it's also just part of it is just the level of stress that maybe parents may have to go through. It could be certain behavior disorders or, whatever it is. And I think that also this perception and the stigma, that's also very important to know about, because it's so negative. Parents also are very negative about their situation. Instead of focusing on the positive things, they're more negative, which is more stressful for them. A lot of people are more in hiding, instead of, taking their child out. It's not really about inclusion. It's because I think that society in these countries are still not really, very friendly to children with disabilities. So that also affects, people wanting to even talk about or getting resources and help related to children with disabilities. And this is probably going to be another roundtable that I'm going to have because there's just so much to talk about this issue as well. So thank you for that, Katherine and Payal, for talking about that. I know, Lara, are you able to answer the next question? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. The next question. Okay. I was going to talk about disabilities.
Oh, you can, of course, that too.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say, from a prosecutor's perspective, having children that are have some sort of disability makes them more vulnerable, makes them more of a target for abuse, because the abuser feels like they won't be able to articulate it, they won't be believed, or anything that could make them more vulnerable, makes it more difficult for the abuse to be disclosed, for it to be reported, and for it to be prosecuted. We do prosecute cases of where children have some sort of disability, because to us, those are the most vulnerable victims. I believe they were targeted because partially of their disability. As far as physical child abuse, we do see that as well, because lots of times, I think there's a difference. There are parents that are child abusers, and there are parents who might lose it one time. And there's a distinction there. And that's why we try, I mean, obviously, if they seriously injure the child, there's no excuse. But that's why we offer this city attorney hearing program that Mike Feuer spoke about, the city attorney, because it gives us an opportunity to help these parents by getting them into some kind of parenting classes. And there are parenting classes for all different ages of kids, to help, you know, with the teenage years, to help with the early years. And so I think children with disabilities are our most vulnerable victims that we see. And I agree with everyone that's talked about the body parts, naming the body parts. One thing that is so frustrating to me is when parents give cute little names to body parts. Like, why would you ever tell a girl her vagina is a cookie? I mean, that's just like beyond me. That's like asking for problems. So I highly recommend to all parents, give the actual body parts the real names. It's a penis, it's a vagina, it's a breast. And so that these children know that those areas are not to be touched.
Thank you, Lara, for sharing that with us. And you also saw the next question. That was a question directed to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I didn't. Let me look.
So I'll just go ahead and read it for you. So
okay.
If the victims of battery reported to law enforcement and their investigation determined to be a suspect, and was a reject from the city attorney's office, would these victims have any other option to bring the suspect to be prosecuted? The law enforcement investigator kept on asking to drop the case while it was into the investigation, and according to the report, it stated lack of cooperation from parents, which were completely false. No city attorney hearing was held for the victims.
Well, that's troubling to hear that law enforcement would be saying that. If it was something that happened in the city of LA, I'm happy to take a look at it. And if you can get me the name so I can try and locate a report and see what happened, I'm happy to take a look at it. As far as, I don't ever consider a report pro-suspect. We do have occasionally cases, and let me tell you, because I think it's a big misnomer, especially on TV and stuff, most children, and I'm talking like in the 90%, do not lie about child sex abuse. And when they are making something up, many times like a mother might try and do it for a custody issue or something like that, we know in the forensic interview, we know in the first like 30 seconds to 2 minutes that this is not true. It's that obvious, because most children will not lie about being sexually abused. It's so hard to disclose, and so they won't lie about it. And that's based on studies, not just me saying it. As far as something happening, if the case has been rejected, yes, the case might be rejected at that time unless more evidence comes forward. Because like I said before, we have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors. So we have to have enough evidence to convince 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt. So sometimes cases that were rejected are later filed when we learn of another victim, of more evidence, something to help make that case a little bit stronger, that we feel that we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay,
Did that answer, I hope?
And I'll also, if needed, I can connect you to that member who asked that question for you.
Right.
Okay, yes, so we have one more question. Let's make it the last question since we've already gone over our time. Our question is, what are some of the prevention efforts or programs being implemented to reduce the risk of victimization of sexual abuse for children with disabilities in the API community? And what county community efforts are needed? Anyone would like to address that question?
Well, it's tough to say what we're doing to prevent. I think we're all here to try to prevent some of this. And I think it takes all of us to connect with each other and see what we can do, what someone needs, how we can help, what's missing, in terms of information, training. I think everyone here, at least I know, would be happy to connect with any of our attendees to see what we can do to help prevent this. So at least we're always open to that.
And Cindy, I know, for example, the Rape Treatment Center in Santa Monica, they have an entire education component where they go out to middle schools, high schools, and colleges to address these issues to parents and students. And they'll go anywhere. They'll go anywhere in the county.
And so, just to be exact with the disability community, though, perhaps maybe we can all try to work together with these organizations to provide services to children and families of disabilities. So that could be something that we could talk about in the future. And just so everyone knows, this is going to be the first of many conversations that I'll be putting together on these issues. And of course, depending on the event, it could be a roundtable like this, a webinar like this, or just some type of informal meeting where we can all meet virtually and discuss about the work that we all do and how we can work together in the future. So, I'm looking forward to that. And this will be, the first of many conversations, like I said. So we're going to have to end this conversation today. And we also have some members of the media here as well. And I just wanted to put this out there too. Media plays such an important role in getting our messages out and our resources out. So I just wanted to thank you for joining us. And I hope you can also continue to show interest in these issues and these topics and cover more stories and not just about the cases that we see on the news, but also, those positive and encouraging stories that we know about even people who have maybe overcome their painful past and all those great programs that are out there to help victims heal. So the more, we get these messages out and bring more awareness to these issues, the more people can be helped, and hopefully in the long run, we'll be able to change this perception of child abuse in the API communities. Okay, well, in closing, there's also going to be a short survey that I'll be sending out to all of our attendees following this webinar. And I'd love to hear your feedback about today's webinar. And also, please let me know if you'd like to stay informed on these future events that I'll be planning and hosting. And of course, if you wish not to be informed, there's a box that you can check. And of course, I'll remove your email address. Just a quick shout out to some of the folks who've always been just so helpful to me when it comes to DV and child abuse issues, and for connecting me with some key members of these fields. There's Irene Lee of the LA County District Attorney's Office, Paula V. Darwin, and of course, Lara Drino of the City Attorney's Office. Thank you all so much. I hope this webinar was helpful to you. Thank you to our panelists, and of course, City Attorney Mike Feuer, who I had to leave. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at the next roundtable. Thank you.